We think we've got it all figured out. And you need to shake that confidence. You need to inject some noise in the system. I write as a curious person. I was kind of a newbie to the psychedelic community, so I think that made it much more accessible to other people. I was a very reluctant psychonaut. I had 6 guided journeys, 2 Ayahuasca Circles, 1 LSD, 1 Psilocybin, 1 5-MeO-DMT. The night before every one of these experiences was sleepless. The cautionary voice was my ego, trying to protect itself against an assault. It's a kind of death, and you fight it. If you've been properly prepared, you're going to surrender to it. As a writer, I really like to bring a variety of different lenses to a topic. If you combine science with personal experience, with history, then you begin to get a whole picture. Something's going on. The culture's ready to have this conversation. I do see these medicines as addressing some of the big problems we face as a society. The environmental crisis, which flows from our disconnection from nature, and tribalism, which flows from our disconnection from people unlike ourselves. I do think that psychedelics can teach us important things about death. Am I less frightened of death? Perhaps. Perhaps I am.
They say that the human race is doomed, that we have lost touch with our true nature, that the media has corrupted us, and that the planet has no future. I disagree. I believe that humanity is full of hope, and that our salvation lies within each one of us. My name is Brian Rose, and my job is to listen, the oldest method of learning known to man. Each week I seek out individuals that are changing the world, people who are living and thinking in a different way. Their stories will challenge your beliefs, make you question your choices, and perhaps inspire you to change. I never planned on doing any of this, but now I can't stop. Join me on this mission and make humanity something we can all be proud of.
It's time for you to man up, to once and for all tell your mind who the fuck is boss. I need a fucking answer. What's it gonna be? I don't know what it is about this fucking sport, but it attracts people that really need to do deep work on themselves.
I failed in this city. All these bad memories. I never really felt like I gave a fuck about me or my life. I almost killed myself,
Think about something that is going to drive you when it really hurts. Some kind of demon you want to fight.
This is not Pussy Man, this is Iron Man. Under pressure reveals true character. What are you gonna do? You're gonna be in Chattanooga, May 20th or what?
You would have seen Michael Pollan on his Netflix show called Cooked, where he talks about the cultural implications of the food we eat. Michael's been talking about this stuff via his writing for most of his life, and now he's decided to dive into the subject of psychedelics with his new book, How to Change Your Mind. It's an incredible look at psychedelics, and this is something we've been talking about since the beginning of Lunge and Reel. We had an episode before my ayahuasca experience and after it. I did the same with DMT, and I've talked about psilocybin. I'm so glad to see Michael really going for it and taking this stuff mainstream. I sent a copy of his book to my dad, and I know it's gonna make some big implications for what we do with our society, politically, legally, and I'm so glad to see he's on board to start talking real about these subjects and what they can do to this society. So I'm so glad you're gonna watch this. Really sit back and send this episode to all of your friends and family and anybody who might not be as educated on how psychedelics can really help us move forward. And speaking of education, inside the London Real Academy now, I'm taking a group of students on my Business Accelerator. It's where I personally mentor you to take yourself, build yourself as a personal brand and sell digital products and build a business with revenues. I'm doing that right now, but also inside the Academy, we have public speaking courses, a course that shows you how to start your own podcast, even courses that teach you how to eat and how to move and how to meditate. So all that's happening inside. I hope you join me. It's a ton of fun. And now I'll leave you with Michael.
London Real doesn't stop when the conversation ends. You see, that's when we get started. Because everything begins with a thought, and then comes the action. The London Real Academy is our global transformation platform. Here we bring together thousands of students from over 75 countries. Whether you want to build a profitable business from your passion, or learn to speak to inspire, or broadcast yourself with your very own podcast, or accelerate your life to become a high-performance person, we have the online accountability course and personal mentoring program that will make your dream a reality. Join us, and we'll take your life to the next level, together. Our next accelerator course is starting soon.
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Michael Pollan, the award-winning author, activist, and journalist, named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. For 25 years, you've been writing about the intersection of nature and culture, selling millions of copies with your bestsellers, The Omnivore's Dilemma, In Defense of Food, and Cooked, which is now a successful Netflix series. Your new book, How to Change Your Mind, dives deep into the world of psychedelics through meetings with shamans, magic mushroom hunts, and using yourself as a guinea pig to take your readers on a journey to the frontiers of the human mind. Michael, welcome to London Real.
Thank you. Very succinct.
It's a pleasure having you here. First, I want to know, what is it like being in London for you? What does this city kind of represent? And even in the field that you're writing about, how are we different than like the LAs and the New Yorks of the world?
That's a good question. I mean, I always love coming here. I usually come here when I'm publishing a book and any excuse I get. So I'm very comfortable here. I haven't approached it with the lens of someone who's thinking about psychedelics, and I'm just starting to meet people in the community. I did an event last night with Robin Carhart Harris at the Royal Institution, and it was really interesting meeting people on the signing line. And the variety of people who are, you know, in a very kind of subterranean, quiet way, deeply interested in this subject. Some are therapists, some are scientists. It was an incredible range of people, computational neuroscientists. So, you know, I just sort of feel like it's a community that I'm just kind of learning about. I've only, you know, been here for a day.
Does that demo look different than the people in the lines in America?
Not fundamentally. No, I would say here, at least, I mean, this sample isn't representative, but it seemed a little more professional here, the people who were interested, than the kinds of people who are interested in California. But even within America, it's very different in California and the East Coast. I would say the West Coast, there's much greater amount of knowledge, bigger community of underground guides, for example. You know, and the funders are all on the West Coast. The funders of the research, which is substantially the tech community in the Bay Area. The Burning Man crowd, you know, there's a slightly different demographic.
Yeah. Well, you know, I got to preface before we get going is that, you know, for me, you know, London Real's been a 7-year adventure, and I've got to sit down with a lot of different people, and now people see me in a suit and tie. But it actually started off kind of around an ayahuasca ceremony back in the day, and I remember we did a before and after episode, and I was terrified, and I had like many people, kind of the Amsterdam mushroom experience with no ceremony, no setting, and I'd sworn to never do it again. I came from banking, where it's about not about ego destroying, it's about ego
building.
And I just wasn't ready. The community said, don't put this on YouTube. I didn't know if we'd get arrested. I figured I could never go back into banking. The Bank of England would bar me or throw me out as an American citizen. But we went in and we did it. And then that's how I ended up going to talk to Carhart Harris and David Nutt and Amanda Fielding and Rick Doblin and a lot of the people you mentioned in your book. And I went on also to do a DMT episode called DMT Before and After, which is actually our most watched episode of all time. This is up against Neil deGrasse Tyson and Eddie Izzard, and it's me literally going in blind and then talking about it afterwards. And so there's people that really want to know about this stuff.
Without question. It's a very quiet community, but there are people, I've been surprised. I mean, having just published this book, it came out about a month ago in the United States, the depth of interest and also the number of people in the closet. That one of the effects of this book, kind of the first mainstream book on this subject, has been to almost license people to tell their stories. I've been really struck by how many journalists reach over and turn off the tape recorder and say, can I tell you a story? And it's usually of a transformative psychedelic experience they had maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago that they've kept in a little box for all that time because there was such a stigma about talking about it. Or there were kids around, or whatever it was, or professional worries, reputational worries. But the experience stayed with them. It had a kind of, they knew it meant something to the course of it was part of their autobiography and an important part. And they hadn't had an opportunity to talk about it. And the stories come out, and I heard one after another, or I get emails. It's just really remarkable, the outpouring. And they're really interesting stories, many of them. And in fact, I worked with a website called Medium, which is kind of a literary blogging website. And we created a space where people could post their stories, and we solicited them. We got 200 stories within a few days, and we put up the best ones. And some of them were fascinating. I mean, stories of transformation, not just trip reports. And so I've been really struck by, there's a world out there that many people are not aware of. You've been on it, though, for a long time, because my introduction to your show came when I just began this research. And I was very curious about a neuroscientist named Robin Carhart Harris, and I started doing web searching. And up comes this endless interview with you on London Real. And I watched it very closely. I think I watched it more than once. And that was kind of my introduction to his work, which led to multiple interviews with him, first for a piece for The New Yorker, then for my book. And he's one of the heroes of the book. So I have to thank you for that introduction.
My pleasure.
That virtual introduction.
My pleasure. And speaking of heroes, I mean, you're on a bit of a hero's journey here. And at some point you crossed the threshold, but that wasn't always the plan. It started off with that article in The New Yorker, right?
Yeah, which was a straight ahead piece of science journalism, no first person. But as in the course of reporting that, and The New Yorker didn't want first person, they wouldn't have published it if it had any first person. They really wanted white coats, This was science. But in the course of writing that, I kept getting inklings that there was an underground, and I was interviewing people who had such incredible experiences that I became intensely curious to have the experience. And I realized when I decided I wanted to write a book, after I finished that article, I sent it to my agent, or I sent it to my editor actually. I said, I think this is my next book. I've just scratched the surface. There's so much more here. It's very rich. There's the history, there's the neuroscience, but I think I've got to, put myself in the story, and for a couple reasons. One is it's kind of what I do as a writer. I'm an immersion journalist. When I wrote about the cattle industry, I bought a cow. When I wrote about architecture, I built a house. So if I'm going to write about psychedelics, I think my readers expect me to see what it's like from the inside, and I love working with that perspective as a writer. And the fact that I was pretty psychedelically naive before this, I hadn't had a big psychedelic experience. I had a couple so-called museum experiences with psilocybin.
Like low dose.
Low dose, aesthetic, interesting, right, but not transformative, not ego dissolving, nothing like that.
And they weren't present in college for you. You kind of
No,
missed
they were
them
later.
on both ends.
Yeah,
me too.
I happened to go to the wrong college at the wrong time or something, and it wasn't around. But frankly, I wouldn't have done it. I didn't feel I was sturdy enough psychologically at that point to do it. And I had absorbed the scare stories of the 60s that, that this could make you go crazy. So the premise that it could actually make you go sane, which is the premise of the research, was, you know, sort of hard to grok. But but I really like what you get as a writer doing something for the first time. I mean, and I learned this from reading a book when I was 13 by George Plimpton called Paper Lion. He was a sports writer, editor of the Paris Review, wonderful writer. And he wanted to reinvent sports writing, which was kind of stuck in a been there, done that kind of mode, you know, written from the sidelines by guys chomping on cigars. And he said, I want to get on the field. He was writing about football, and he persuaded the Detroit Lions to let him go through summer training and actually play quarterback in an exhibition game. Something would get him killed now. I mean, the guys are so much bigger, and the play is so much rougher. This is in the 60s. But he acquired a perspective that allowed him to see football with completely new eyes that even a very experienced football player doesn't have anymore, because they've forgotten what it's like. It's just routine for them. And someone on the sidelines doesn't have it. But the person doing it for the first time has a lens that no one else has, and a sense of wonder and awe that you'll never get again. And so I thought that this experience lent itself to that, and that I needed to do it. And also, I was jealous of the people I was interviewing. They were having experiences. I had never had a spiritual experience, I didn't think. And here they were having these, you know, these big spiritual experiences, and I wanted one.
Were you frightened the first time you went in? LSD?
I was frightened every time.
Every time. Good answer.
Yeah, every time. I mean, every one of I had 6 guided journeys, 2 Ayahuasca Circles, 1 LSD, 1 Psilocybin, 1 5-MeO-DMT. And then a kind of unguided high-dose psilocybin experience.
At home? With
your
wife?
With my wife, yeah.
Okay.
And with the exception of that one, which was somewhat spontaneous, the night before, every one of these experiences was sleepless. I was arguing with myself. I was like, you really want to go up on this mountain with this guy you barely know, whose father was a Nazi, and allow yourself to, you know, completely like give up control of your mind. What if you have a heart attack? You know, I wasn't a kid. Is this guy going to call for an ambulance and risk his own freedom? You could die up there. And then this other voice saying, well, you know, aren't you curious about this experience? This could be transformative. And by the way, you have a book to write. And
that doesn't hurt either, right? Getting you over the line?
It did, and that kind of got me over the line. I realized later that voice, the cautionary voice, was my ego trying to protect itself against an assault, and that I was about to mount on it. And of course, your ego has command of your rational faculties, so it makes really good arguments.
Right, and it manifests in all sorts of ways, right?
It's so insidious.
Oh, I just stubbed my toe. I broke my foot. I can't go.
It's a bad day.
You come up with a variety of things.
You could have. And but in every case, I got there, still very nervous and not having had any sleep. And once I got past the point of no return and put the blotter paper on my tongue or ingested them, you know, started eating the mushroom, the worry vanished, and I really was able to let go, and that surprised me. I'm very fatalistic, and I don't look back very much generally. And I knew that, okay, well, you've started, you're on the journey, might as well get with it, and I did. And in the end, you know, it's so important to surrender to the experience. I mean, the worst thing you can do is resist what's happening, especially as you watch your ego kind of fall apart. It's a death. It's a kind of death, and you fight it. Every nerve in your body wants to fight it, but if you've been properly prepared, you're going to surrender to it and trust and let go. And I was able to do that, luckily, and I didn't get into any of those kind of resistance scenarios that we call bad trips very often.
Did you have guidance during, or just kind of before to prepare you? Look, if this happens, go with it, breathe.
So, your viewers and listeners probably know this, but there's a substantial difference between a guided psychedelic journey and the usual so-called recreational use of these drugs. In a guided journey, whether it's above ground in clinical trials at Imperial College or NYU or Johns Hopkins, or underground, where there's, at least in America, I'm sure it's true here too, there's a network of very professional underground guides, many of whom are trained therapists. There are 3 stages to it. There's the preparation, where they tell you what's going to happen and how it's going to play out to the extent that they can. And they offer you a set of flight instructions, as many of them call it, which is what to do if you see anything scary. If you see a monster, don't try to run away. Stand your ground. Ask it, what does it have to teach you? What are you doing in my mind? If you see a staircase, go up it. If you see a door, open it. Basically surrender to the experience, relax your mind and float downstream, as John Lennon memorably put it, in Tomorrow Never Knows. And
you actually do get better at this process, don't you, the more you do?
Well, those skills, you internalize that advice, and certainly later when I did have some difficult experiences, I could call on those mantras, trust and let go, and surrender, and it can be very helpful. So that's really useful. They also very often will ask you to set an intention. So do you want to deal with your mortality in the case of the cancer patients in that trial? Do you want to quit an addiction? And in my case, I didn't have a problem I wanted to fix. I wanted to just learn more about my mind and learn whatever this substance had to teach me. And then during the experience, they're with you the whole time. The underground guides is usually 1. Overground, there are 2. There's always a man and a woman. And you have to trust this person, because you're laying down your defenses. You're in a very vulnerable state. And if you don't feel safe, you're going to have a bad reaction. And so you have to pick someone that you really trust. And I had that rapport with people. I interviewed people that I was like, not trusting my mind to this person.
Somebody told you they put the dead bodies somewhere, right? And
yeah.
It was a joke.
Yeah.
It wasn't a joke, but bad vibes.
I don't know what it was. I said, what if someone dies? And he said, well, we bury him with all the other dead people. I was like, that's not what I wanted to hear.
Yeah.
So he was out.
I interviewed a guy about an Iboga experience one time, which we can talk about later, but I just didn't get a vibe from him. And I'm thinking, I'm going to be physically incapacitated for 36 hours.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I know. You had trust. You really have to trust this person. This is a profound relationship for that period of time, and it's got to be a good one. During the experience, you're wearing eye shades. It's a very internalized experience. I was trying to simulate what was happening in the university trials to understand them. And they're playing music. But
you can still hear them a little bit if they need to talk to you.
Oh yeah, yeah. They'll ask you. They'll check in every half hour, and they'll say like, "Where are you?" Okay. Or not how you're doing, but they'll often say, "Where are you?" And it reminds you to, take stock of where you are at that moment. So it's useful, but it's just a reminder that someone's there if you get into trouble,
right?
And with a comforting hand or pat on the shoulder, whatever it is.
The equivalent in the Ayahuasca ceremony is kind of the icaros you hear from the shaman,
yes.
which just lets you know someone's there.
Exactly.
And then, but they don't actually really get involved really much, but they're there. You know they're there.
It's just a presence. And in fact, they don't want to direct you too much because the experience it can be shaped by suggestions so powerfully that a word from them could send you down a path that may not be the path your mind needs to take. And so there's a fundamental trust in the brain's ability to heal itself. In the same way your body, if you cut yourself, you don't have to teach your body how to heal that. It knows. And many of these therapists believe the same is true of the mind. And so that you shouldn't direct the psychedelic experience too much. You should let it unfold. It will have its own inherent logic. So they're very quiet. They are playing the music. The difference between the underground and the overground is the above ground therapists have a set playlist. Since they're conducting scientific trials, they don't want to change the variables, so everybody hears the same playlist. And they're quite beautiful. Some argue that the Johns Hopkins playlist is kind of old white dead guys.
It's like rock and roll or classical?
No, it's classical. A lot of classical music, a lot of choral music. It's quite beautiful, but it also has a kind of religious tint to it that I think primes a kind of mystical experience. Other ones are much more kind of neutral, spatial music, Philip Glass, Brian Eno, people like that.
Okay, and it makes a difference. I mean,
it makes a huge
I remember having my iPod on shuffle when I went in, and it was a psilocybin experience, and like a hip hop song came up, and I was just like, oh my gosh, no.
It can be the wrong music. And also, I don't think you should use your own music because you have too many associations with it. Okay. I think that there's something to be said for someone else choosing the music, it being somewhat neutral, no vocals, But anyway, the underground guides tend to play DJ, and they change the music depending on what they think. And I actually got into arguments with some of the music, which I really didn't like. There was a lot of new age.
During, you said, please turn that off.
Yeah, or
Okay.
can we put on something else? Or
Yeah.
this is like music for a massage in the spa. You know, I'm having a big mental experience here.
Right.
It's not what I want. But anyway, and then the last stage of the guiding afterwards is the integration, and that's really, really important. The idea there is to help you make sense of what happened. You tell the story, and they underscore certain themes that, you know, perhaps relate to your intention, and they basically also help you extract any lessons that you can then apply to your life. And I found that's really useful, and they're not all that good at it, but that's where being a good therapist comes in.
Okay.
So that's the kind of experience I was seeking. I also had a couple Ayahuasca circles,
Which
we
have
can talk
similar
about.
practices, because at the end you actually usually have a conversation
Yeah, you go.
with the shaman in
yeah,
the morning.
I did it in a group, and there were about 12 people, and we would go around the circle, and everybody would talk a little bit about their experience and what they learned from it. And it's a very interesting, useful exercise. There's a kind of energy you get from the group that's very distinctive. And my first group was all women. I was lucky to be invited to this circle. And all very powerful, accomplished women. And there was this incredible female energy in the room. Yeah, it was that was very positive. It wasn't as overwhelming as I'd been prepared to think ayahuasca would be, but it was nevertheless very productive.
They say Mother Ayahuasca is gentle on the first one, but I don't
Is
know
that
if
right?
that's just wives' tales, but that's
Yeah,
what I always
I had a
hearing.
second one that was less gentle, but still bearable. One of the things I've learned about myself is I metabolize all these drugs much faster than anyone around me. I don't know why.
So they hit you fast,
They hit me fast,
and then
I have a very intense period, but I come out of it really quickly. Like even an LSD trip, I was done in a couple hours instead of the usual 10 or 12.
wow.
So I don't know what that is. It's something about my liver.
And ayahuasca as well. It was like
Ayahuasca as well. Yeah, I was like twiddling my thumbs while everyone else was still flying.
Do you think there are bad trips? I mean,
Yeah, you know, it's not a good term to use. And most of the good guides I talk to say we call them challenging trips. And I see their point, because a lot of very valuable things can be learned on a bad trip if it's correctly processed and integrated. Why did you have it? What was going on? It's like having a nightmare that you sit down with your therapist and try to sort through. As they're happening, they can feel pretty awful. I had what I thought of as a terrible trip on 5-MeO-DMT. It was just horrifying. And I wouldn't wish it on anyone. On the other hand, some positive things came out of it. So it's a real phenomenon. I mean, people get into either a very dark place or a place where they want to be done. I mean, I hear that the most people on LSD. It's like, I want this to be over. And of course, it goes on for a very long time, and you can't turn it off. And that can make people feel claustrophobic, that they're trapped somewhere. And I've had that sensation. I understand what that is. But one of the things that I learned from guides is move toward that pain, move toward it, and go in and through, as they say at Imperial College. And that's good advice, and to look at whatever is horrifying you. And if you really do go toward it rather than fight it, you pass through it very often and can get to a much happier place.
yeah, I interviewed back in these early kind of Carhart Harris days an author of a book called The Psilocybin Solution. And he said a few things that I remember when I'm inside. And he said, first one was just be with it. If you're having the pain, if you're having that experience, be with it. Don't try to run from it, escape from it. And it's actually a great metaphor for life as well.
It is.
Be with the pain and be with the anger and listen and process. Don't drink it away or pull out the mobile it away. Be with it. And the other thing he said is, there are no bad trips. You are just learning at a rate that you are not accustomed to.
Oh, that's great.
And I thought that was always good. You know, I mean, we've had a breakup with a girlfriend, and that's the same thing. You're learning at a rate you're not accustomed to. And so I always try to frame it. That being said, you should make intelligent decisions about set and setting.
Yes, and there's a different kind of bad trip that happens because you're really careless about the way you're using the drugs. And, we've heard about set and setting since Timothy Leary's time. He's the first person to start using those terms, but they can't be underestimated. And that the inward and outward circumstances, your mindset and where you physically are, will shape the experience to a remarkable extent. And so if you are using these drugs to escape a bad situation, it'll get worse. People tell me amazing stories about, like, oh, we took acid in the parking lot before we went to school in high school. It's like, really? I don't think that's a good idea.
No, I can't even imagine that.
I can't either.
Personally.
And they had a horrible experience and they never went near it again. And so there is a kind of bad trip born of you doing it in the wrong circumstance, where you have to be together, you have to sit in a chair in the classroom, whatever it is. This isn't like cannabis. These are very powerful substances, and they have to be used with great care, and I think with a certain amount of supervision, actually. Even if you're going to be guided by a peer, having someone who's staying close to ground level is really important. And when we figure out what to do with these substances in terms of the law, I don't have a clear answer. I do think one of the lessons, if you think about the traditional cultures who've used these substances or ones like it for thousands of years, look how they did it. They had many more centuries of experience than we've had, because these drugs have only been around really since the 50s, psychedelics. And they always have a ceremony. There's always an elder or a shaman or a healer or a curandera, somebody who knows the territory and is organizing the experience. Very seldom are the drugs ever taken alone. There's somebody there or a group there. And it has this cultural container. And that flows from the recognition that they're very powerful, very destabilizing substances that should not be used in a blithe or thoughtless manner. And the molecules arrived without that package in the West, right? Gordon Wasson goes to Mexico, tries psilocybin, writes this rave article about it in Time magazine. Timothy Leary tells everybody to turn on, tune in, drop out. No one took the trouble to devise a proper container. And it was all trial and error, throwing it up against the wall, seeing what worked. Do you take these drugs at a party? Do you take them alone? I mean, all the different ways they were used in the 60s, concerts, at the beach, whatever. The traditional container may not be right for Western civilization. We may not have ascribe the same authority to shamans as traditional people do. Our doctors are our shamans to some extent. But we need to devise a proper container. And in ayahuasca, we see people adopting the Amazonian container and its various permutations. But I think it's one of the most interesting cultural projects to work on right now, is to figure out what is that container. There's a medical container that's getting developed, for mental health treatment, and that's proving to be, very promising. But is that going to be the one for people who aren't sick? I don't know. But I have no doubt that you need a container, and simply legalizing these drugs, as we're doing in the United States with cannabis state by state, doesn't seem to me the right way. I mean, the virtue of legalizing something is you can regulate it, whereas if you have prohibition, anything goes, oddly enough.
Right. And LSD was legal, for a long period of time.
It was until 1970, or the last years of the 60s in some states. So all these issues need to be attended to. I mean, and I have a lot of respect for these molecules, and that involves not wanting to see them used in a careless way.
Do you think 50 years from now there'll be kind of clinics in America where grandma can go, and as opposed to go down to Mexico for a week, she can go to the clinic and have a guided ceremony?
I think there's a good chance. I think that there's a good chance that, right now we're not on the same path that cannabis is on. Cannabis was decided by popular referendum in various states. And first we had medical marijuana that changed the image from Cheech and Chong to something a little more serious and healing. And then we submitted it to the voters, and people approved it. They got used to the idea, and they realized that it was better regulated than unregulated, as it had been under Prohibition. That path is not the one that we're on with psilocybin, which is the psychedelic most likely to receive approval and become common.
Because it's natural or simple, or the
reason it's going to be psilocybin is because that's what the researchers use. And the reason they use it, there are two reasons they use it. One is it's more obscure. It doesn't have all the baggage that attaches to LSD. You know, your average politician has never heard of psilocybin. If he got up and made a speech railing about the government supporting psilocybin research, no one would know what he's talking about. Whereas if he got up and said the government supporting LSD research, everybody would know. And so it would be too controversial. LSD has too much baggage. The other reason, though, is psilocybin fits into the workday a little better if you're a therapist. I mean, if you're administering LSD, that could be 10 hours. You know, you're not gonna get home for dinner. So the researchers are happier to work with a medicine that, you know, its action is 5 or 6 hours. You can fit that into the therapeutic day. So those are the reasons. And so psilocybin is on a track, along with MDMA, ecstasy, for FDA drug approval and EMA drug approval. When that happens, doctors, the drugs will have to be reclassified. They're no longer Schedule I, which says no recognized medical use and a drug of high potential for abuse. Well, it will have a recognized medical use, so it'll be rescheduled to 2 or 3. And then doctors will have the ability to prescribe. It'll be approved first for depression, probably in psilocybin, or post-traumatic stress with MDMA. But doctors can prescribe off-label. Once a drug is legal, they can use it in other ways. That's what's happening with ketamine right now. It's approved as an anesthetic, but it's being used, at least in the States, I don't know if it's true here, as a treatment for depression. So at that point, you can imagine a clinic starting where people come and there's a doctor employed by the clinic who's writing the prescriptions, and there might be mental health spas, you know, that people go to, like gyms, and they go occasionally to have this experience. Or you might find that the doctor in charge at a hospice would have the ability to prescribe psilocybin to someone who's dying,
Right.
Or perhaps their caregivers.
Let's talk about death. Why, I think it's John Hopkins who originally started looking at that, giving psilocybin to their terminally ill cancer patients. There's a lot, I mean, we could spend a whole episode talking about death, how these drugs allow someone to decrease anxiety and accept their own death. I mean, we could talk about all the human decisions we make today based on our own fear of our own death.
Death, big issue.
You know, yeah. It's a great book called The Denial of Death that says,
Right.
you know, everything we construct around us is to just kind of deny that
Hold
it's
it
there.
off. That's right.
What's your read on what you've seen so far that's happening there?
So that's really what got me interested. It was hearing about that trial, which sounded initially so implausible. I mean, here they were giving people with many of them with terminal cancer diagnosis. They all had cancer diagnosis. Originally, it was all going to be terminal, but they were having trouble recruiting, so they opened up people with serious diagnoses that might survive. And they were giving them a guided psilocybin trip. And that seems so counterintuitive to me. I can't imagine if I had a terminal diagnosis, the first thing I would want to do is have a trip that would take me to these very dark places, force me to confront what was going on. But in fact, a great many people who suffer from what the doctors call existential distress, which is their term for the combination of depression, anxiety, and fear that accompanies contemplation of your imminent death, were looking for relief and willing to try this. And so I interviewed a lot of these people, and their stories were remarkable. Just to give you an example, I interviewed this one woman, her name is Dinah Baser, and she's 60-ish, no psychedelic experience, had been figure skating, is still, I guess, a figure skating instructor in Manhattan. And she had ovarian cancer and had been treated for it and was in remission, but nevertheless was terrified of recurrence and debilitated, paralyzed by it. She couldn't do anything. She just thought the next day the other shoe would drop. And she heard about this trial at NYU, New York University, and had a guided psilocybin trip. And what happened was, and this happens in a lot of the cancer patients, the experience is kind of this imaginative, intrapsychic movie. And in her case, it took her inside her body. And in many cases, people go in and see their cancer, confront their cancer. Right. And she, what she saw, though, was a black mass under her rib cage. So it wasn't her cancer, it was something else. And she recognized immediately what it was. It was her fear. And when she saw it, she screams out. Now remember, she's got two guides there. They don't know what's going on in her head. And she screams, "Get the fuck out of my body." And it evaporates, just like that. And afterwards, and I wrote about her, and I said, after her experience, her fear of recurrence was substantially diminished. This is in the New Yorker piece. And the New Yorker fact checkers called her and read her the line and said, "Is this true?" And she said, "No, that's not true. He got it wrong. The fear was eliminated, completely eliminated." And she also told me something that I found so perplexing, which was that she told me she was an atheist, but nevertheless, during the experience, she felt as though she'd been bathed in God's love. And I said, "Are you still an atheist?" She says, "Yes." I said, "So why are you using this God language?" She says, "Because we don't have a word big enough for what I felt. That's the biggest word we have." I thought that was quite beautiful. So I talked to a series of people like that, and those conversations to me were very meaningful, in part because my dad at the time had gotten a terminal diagnosis for lung cancer. And he was going through his own process, which was very internal, and he really didn't want to talk about it. And I sort of needed to talk about it because I was dealing with it. And so the fact that I didn't realize this till after the book even was done, that was kind of the personal subtext of the book, was thinking about death and talking to people who could talk openly about death and what they imagined it to be like. And they were working on it through their psilocybin journeys and their work with their therapist before and after. And my dad was processing it in a very different, very internal way. So a friend read the book after it was done and surprised me by saying, "Oh, wow, your father's on every page." And it wasn't until then that I realized, oh, that's why I was so interested in this. That's why I had to know what these people were dealing with.
It's dedicated to your father.
It
too.
is dedicated.
And I
to
wonder
my father.
why, and now I know why.
Yeah, no, that is why he was grappling with these issues, and I to this day, and he passed in January. I don't know exactly how he processed it, and it was a generational thing. He wasn't going to talk about it.
And it's interesting how you say it, because, for example, maybe he could have processed it better, but also by doing that, everyone around him might have been able to process that better. So
yes, I think that's true. And I think, Catherine McLean, who's one of the early researchers at Hopkins who worked on this, she felt strongly that the value of the psilocybin journey should not be restricted to the patient, that the caregivers, too, would get a benefit from it. Because they, too, are facing death at one remove, but it's very much on their mind. And the relief people got was, I heard lots of different stories, and the common thread, some people did have an image of an afterlife, and they had a sense that they were going to enter some great plane of consciousness, or that there was a plane of love that, awaited them, and they were pulling back from that, but they saw what was coming, and that was enormously comforting. Others, though, had a kind of more naturalistic idea. I remember this one woman, also in her 60s, and also a New Yorker, told me about going underground, and she was passing through underground, and she hit this wall, and she realized it was the wall of a crematorium, and that she died, and that she then kind of was dissolved in the soil and taken up by the plants, and it was okay. Now, is that a vision of the afterlife? That's actually what happens very often, right? I mean, that's, we do dissolve and we are taken up by life, or whether we're cremated or whatever it is. But what was going on is her sense of who she was had dissolved, and that her sense of self-interest had expanded. It wasn't just this bag of bones that we are. It wasn't this narrow idea of myself. And this is what Bertrand Russell said when he was asked how to die well. He said, to the extent you can expand your sense of what are the boundaries of yourself, what is your self-interest, to take in first your family, your offspring, perhaps your community, perhaps the natural world, perhaps the universe. The wider you make that sense of self, the less consequential your own extinction becomes. And I think that's what's happening. I think that on the psychedelic experience, people are experiencing a consciousness that's less bound by their bodies, less bound by their narrow ego, by their ego, and that you can see the world, at least temporarily, from a much broader perspective that feels to some people like a consciousness that extends beyond your head. I mean, that you're partaking in something that's in the world. And some people do come to the conclusion that consciousness exists outside the mind, and that we tune it in. And that's a very common psychedelic insight, but it's also a philosophical position of Henri Bergson and people like that.